Alright guys, so I am starting a little series of less lengthy videos to review the entire Heisei line of Godzilla films. I felt each film deserved its own video, as each brought a unique perspective on what was going on in Japan at the time when each film was made. Not to mention, each of these films introduced something new and exciting to the character of Godzilla we had not yet seen before. This is arguably Godzilla's strongest timeline in terms of consistency and world building. The first film in this timeline is the original 1954 film, but I already reviewed that one, link in description. Anyway, Godzilla had 15 movies, started in 1954 and ending in 1975. Due to diminishing returns, the franchise was put on hold. Tomoyuki Tanaka, the producer of Godzilla, and the man who first envisioned the creature rising from the oceans, felt that Godzilla had become too silly in his later films. When the studio decided to bring the monster back, it was decided too that the creature would be brought back to their more serious roots. In order to do this, the first 14 sequels were removed from the timeline, making this 1984 film a direct sequel, taking place 30 years after the events of the original. In this world, Godzilla has not been seen after the events of the 1954 movie. After the lone survivor of a shipwreck sees the creature, word eventually gets out that Godzilla has returned. Due to Dr. Serizawa's weapon being lost to time, there's no reliable way to destroy the creature. However, humanity is a little more technologically advanced than in real life, meaning they have more weapons at their disposal. Unfortunately, the events transpiring on Japanese soil lead the United States and the Soviet Union to intervene, causing more issues for the Japanese as they struggle between the two superpowers and Godzilla. For those of you wondering, I am reviewing the original 1984 version of this film, not the edited American version with Raymond Burr. And fun fact, despite this being the first film of the Heisei timeline, this film was released during the Showa era. Showa and Heisei, of course, refer to who was the emperor of Japan at the time. Currently, it is the Reiwa era. This film was just put into the Heisei moniker because all the films released after it took place in the Heisei. Anyway, this movie goes into the Cold War tensions of the time. When this film was made, the Cold War was still ongoing and the threat of nuclear war was always prominent. However, this movie is told from the perspective of neither the US or the USSR, but Japan, who is quite literally stuck between the two. What's interesting is that neither the US or the Soviet Union are ever portrayed as being morally higher than the other. While it is understandable that they would both want to take action against Godzilla, it is against the wishes of Japan. The Soviet Union prepares to launch a nuclear missile at Godzilla, and the US wants control over the operation. Meanwhile, Japan is understandably against the use of nuclear weapons on their soil and adamantly refuses the plan. Unlike other Godzilla films, Japan isn't existing in a vacuum. Usually the US doesn't get more than a mention in these movies, which makes sense for the purpose of most Godzilla movies, but in this film they wanted to examine this relationship. The US obviously has its foot on Japan, maintaining military bases across the archipelago and keeping the islands firmly as a US ally in the face of Russia and China. Even to this day, Japanese Godzilla movies still take on this, especially seen in the case of Shin Godzilla. This movie shows Japan's wish to be able to have more autonomy from the US, but more importantly, not to be put in between a conflict that's ultimately between the United States and the Soviet Union. It represents the wider feeling of the planet. No one actually wants to die in this war, but we all feel we have no control over it. Interestingly, the Japanese government is not free from criticism either, as when Godzilla is initially discovered, Japan tries to cover up the whole ordeal, not revealing that the giant, very dangerous fire-breathing monster has returned until they are forced to. Meanwhile, the movie makes a point that it's the conflict that is evil, not the individuals who happen to be American, Soviet, or Japanese, as the Soviet captain does everything he can before his death to stop the missile that is about to be launched on accident, and it is the US that is able to intercept that same missile before it hits Japan. So there is some nuance here. Essentially, this movie derides the world powers for being so enveloped in their own self-interests that they save face before people, that they will continue their squabbling even when a nuclear creature the size of a skyscraper emerges from the ocean causing untold destruction. Ultimately, it is up to the people who know what they are doing, like Professor Hayashida, and not just the politicians, who has to put together a plan that will save Japan from Godzilla, that is different than just hitting him with a big bomb, because that plan will ultimately cause even more damage than Godzilla himself. One last thing of note I want to bring up is the theme of revenge. Hiroshi Okumura wants nothing more than for Godzilla to be destroyed, since the entire crew of his ship was lost to the monster. Whenever he speaks like this, Hayashida just gives him this look. His goals line up with Okumura, but the reasons for why they are doing so are different. Hayashida ultimately doesn't hate Godzilla. He takes on the mission because it will save the lives of many. At the end of the movie, when Godzilla is tossed into his fiery prison, the music is very tragic, and Hayashida does not celebrate the accomplishment. Rather, there is a sense of loss. Godzilla is a creature that we are ultimately responsible for. Its existence is humanity's fault, and this living being is forced through all this pain and tossed into a volcano so it can be forgotten. It is tragic, but in the end it is uncertain whether or not Godzilla is really gone. He is the consequence of what humanity has done, and the world is still pointing their nuclear missiles at each other. So Godzilla remains. Godzilla, like humanity, is trapped by the end of this movie, not knowing how to go on. And one last thing. I thought the guy that stayed behind in the city just so he can have it all to himself was very funny. Anyway, that's all I got for today's video, and as always, thanks for watching.